On the cold autumn evening of November 2nd, 1755, inside the grand Hofburg Palace in Vienna, a child was born who would one day become the most controversial queen in French history. Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna entered the world as the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa and Emperor Francis III of the Holy Roman Empire. The date of her birth held a peculiar significance. November 2nd was All Souls' Day in the Catholic calendar, a day dedicated to mourning the dead. This sombre association troubled her mother, who insisted that her daughter's birthday celebrations be moved to November 1st All Saints' Day, a more joyful occasion. Perhaps this early attempt to shield the child from darkness was a premonition of the shadows that would eventually consume her life. The birth itself had been fraught with difficulty. Empress Maria Theresa, who had delivered 14 children before with relative ease, experienced serious complications during this labour. Doctors gathered around the bedside feared for the Empress's life as she struggled to bring her youngest daughter into the world. When the child finally arrived, healthy and crying, relief flooded through the palace. The infant was immediately baptised according to custom, with the King and Queen of Portugal serving as godparents, though they were represented by proxies at the ceremony. Young Maria Antonia was placed under the care of Countess von Brandeis, the governess of the imperial children. Life in the Habsburg court was one of grandeur and privilege. The imperial Semigeden divided their time between two magnificent palaces, the Hofburg Palace in the heart of Vienna during the fall and winter months, and the spectacular Schönbrunn Palace in the countryside for spring and summer. Schönbrunn, with its extensive gardens, fountains, and greenhouse filled with exotic plants, became young Antonia's playground. She spent her early years sledding down snowy hills in winter, drinking hot chocolate by warm fires, and in summer, splashing in the palace fountains and running through endless gardens with her siblings. The young Archduchess was described as a charming child, full of energy and life. She had bright grey-blue eyes and light ash-blonde hair that caught the sunlight when she played outdoors. Unlike many of her older siblings, Maria Antonia showed little interest in scholarly pursuits. She was not naturally inclined toward books or academic subjects. Her education, typical for an aristocratic girl of the 18th century, focused primarily on religious instruction and moral principles. While her brothers studied philosophy, mathematics, and statecraft, Maria Antonia learned embroidery, dancing, and music. She did show genuine talent in the arts. She could play the harp and harpsichord with considerable skill, and her singing voice was sweet and melodious. One particularly memorable moment from her childhood occurred when the young prodigy, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, visited the Habsburg court. The child musician performed for the imperial family, dazzling them with his extraordinary abilities. According to legend, the 7-year-old Mozart, after finishing his performance, boldly approached young Maria Antonia and asked her to marry him when they grew up. The incident became a charming anecdote, though the two would never meet again. Their paths, which crossed so innocently in childhood, would diverge dramatically as she became the Queen of France and he the great composer who would later write The Marriage of Figaro, an opera that would help undermine the very monarchy she represented. Marie Antonia's childhood was relatively carefree, but she was not entirely sheltered from the realities of royal duty. The Habsburg Empire was one of the great powers of Europe, and marriages among the children of Maria Theresa served as crucial diplomatic tools. The Empress was a master of political marriages, weaving a vast network of European kinship through her children. One by one, Maria Antonia watched her older siblings marry into various royal houses across the continent. Her sisters were sent to Naples, Parma, and other kingdoms. Each departure was marked by grand ceremonies and tearful farewells. For many years, young Maria Antonia probably assumed she would follow a similar path, perhaps marrying some minor German prince or Italian duke. She could not have imagined that her mother had far more ambitious plans for her. The youngest daughter, overlooked and underestimated, would become the centerpiece of Maria Theresa's greatest diplomatic achievement. For centuries, the houses of Habsburg and Bourbon had been enemies. France and Austria had fought each other through generations, their rivalry shaping the political landscape of Europe. But in the middle of the 18th century, the old order began to shift. The 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, had redrawn the map of European alliances. A new and dangerous enemy had emerged: Prussia, under the ambitious Frederick the Great. Both France and Austria found themselves threatened by Prussian expansion, and both realized they shared a common interest in containing this rising power. This recognition led to what historians call the reversal of alliances, or renversement des alliances. France and Austria, hereditary enemies, would become allies, and nothing seals an alliance more permanently than a royal marriage. Maria Theresa, ever the pragmatic ruler, saw the opportunity to cement this new relationship through the union of her youngest daughter with the heir to the French throne. In 1765, the French Dauphin Louis Ferdinand died unexpectedly. His death changed the line of succession. The title of Dauphin, the designation for the heir to the French throne, passed to his 11-year-old son Louis Auguste. This boy, the grandson of the aging King Louis XV, was now next in line to rule France. He was shy, awkward, and far more interested in locksmithing and hunting than in courtly affairs. But he was the future king, and he needed a wife. Negotiations began in earnest. When Maria Antoinette was only 11 years old, it was decided that she would be betrothed to Louis Auguste. From that moment, her life was no longer her own. She became the subject of intense scrutiny and preparation. Every aspect of her education and deportment was examined and found wanting. She needed to be transformed from an Austrian archduchess into a French dauphine. French tutors were brought to Vienna to instruct the young girl in the language, history, and customs of her future homeland. She struggled with her lessons. Languages did not come easily to her, and she had difficulty mastering proper French pronunciation. Her teeth were crooked, which affected her speech, so she was subjected to painful dental procedures to correct them. Her posture was examined, her walk was analysed, her manners were critiqued. Nothing about her was deemed quite suitable for the sophisticated French court. One tutor sent back reports to France noting that Maria Antoinette was more intelligent than generally supposed, but that she was lazy and extremely frivolous, making her hard to teach. Despite these challenges, the preparations continued relentlessly. For 3 years, from age 11 to 14, Maria Antoinette underwent this intensive transformation. Her mother sent her stern letters reminding her of her duty, warning her that the fate of the Austrian Empire rested partially on her shoulders. The pressure on this young girl was immense. By the spring of 1770, when Maria Antoinette was 14 years old, it was decided that she was ready, or at least as ready as she would ever be. On April 19, 1770, a proxy wedding ceremony was held in Vienna. Maria Antoinette stood beside her brother, Archduke Ferdinand, who represented the absent Louis Auguste. She formally renounced her rights to the Habsburg domains. From that moment, she was no longer simply an Austrian princess, she was the Dauphine of France. 2 days after the proxy wedding, Maria Antoinette left Vienna forever. The departure was an elaborate spectacle. She travelled in a magnificent coach of gold and glass, part of a procession that included 57 carriages, 117 footmen, and 376 horses. The journey to France would take 2 weeks, and with each mile travelled, she moved further from everything she had ever known. The girl carried with her trunks filled with elaborate gowns, jewels, and personal belongings. But when she reached the border between Austria and France, at a small island in the Rhine River near Strasbourg, she discovered that she could take nothing with her. A special pavilion had been constructed on this neutral ground for a ceremony that symbolised her complete transformation. She entered one side of the pavilion as Maria Antoinette of Austria. Inside, she was stripped of every article of Austrian clothing, every piece of jewellery, every personal possession. She stood naked before attendants, divested of her past. Then she was dressed entirely in French garments, from her undergarments to her gown, from her shoes to her hair ornaments. When she emerged from the other side of the pavilion, she was no longer Maria Antoinette. She was Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. This ceremony was meant to symbolise her complete adoption of French identity, but it must have been a deeply unsettling experience for the 14-year-old girl. She had been stripped of her identity, her nationality, her very self, and remade into something else. Everything familiar had been taken from her. She was alone in a foreign country, about to meet a husband she had never seen, entering a court notorious for its complexity and cruelty. On May 14, 1770, at the edge of the forest of Compiègne, Marie Antoinette met Louis Auguste for the first time. The meeting was awkward. Louis was 15 years old, heavyset, with poor eyesight and a tendency to stammer when nervous. He was not handsome, nor was he particularly charming. The young man was painfully shy and had been raised in relative isolation. He had been thoroughly indoctrinated by his tutors with anti-Austrian sentiment. He had been taught to view Austria as France's enemy, and now he was being asked to marry an Austrian princess. Marie Antoinette, for her part, tried to fulfill her duty with grace. She was pretty, vivacious, and determined to please, but the cultural differences were immediately apparent. She struggled with French idioms and made small mistakes in etiquette that were noticed by the critical courtiers surrounding them. Nevertheless, the political wheels were in motion, and the wedding would proceed regardless of personal compatibility. On May 16, 1770, the official wedding ceremony took place in the royal chapel at Versailles. The chapel was magnificent, with soaring curlicues and elaborate decorations. Marie Antoinette wore a gown of silver-white cloth that glittered with hundreds of diamonds. The ceremony itself was grand and exhausting. After the wedding mass, there was a formal banquet where the young couple sat on display while thousands watched the meet. Then came the procession through the Hall of Mirrors, that spectacular gallery lined with mirrors and windows, where they walked before the assembled court. They performed the minuet, a complex dance without mistakes, which was seen as a good omen. Finally came the ritual bedding ceremony. In the presence of dozens of courtiers, the young couple was blessed by the archbishop and placed in bed together. The curtains were drawn and the crowd reluctantly dispersed, but nothing happened. The next morning, when courtiers eagerly inquired about the consummation of the marriage, the news was disappointing. Louis had written a single word in his diary, rien, meaning nothing. What should have been a brief awkwardness turned into a prolonged crisis. Days passed, weeks passed, months stretched into years, and still the marriage remained unconsummated. This was not merely a private matter. The entire purpose of the marriage was to produce an heir who would bind France and Austria together through blood. Without children, the alliance was vulnerable. Without an heir, Marie Antoinette's position was precarious. The reasons for this failure have been debated by historians for centuries. Some accounts suggest that Louis suffered from a physical condition called phimosis, which made intercourse painful or impossible. Others argue that the problem was entirely psychological. Louis was socially awkward, sexually inexperienced, and had been raised with the idea that Austrians were not to be trusted. Still others suggest that both husband and wife were simply too young and too ignorant to know how to proceed. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Night after night, Louis would visit Marie Antoinette's bedchamber. According to later testimony, he would introduce himself into her, remain there without moving for approximately 2 minutes, then withdraw without completing the act and bid her goodnight. He seemed to believe he was fulfilling his marital duty, but clearly something was fundamentally wrong. Marie Antoinette was anxious and distressed. Letters flew between Versailles and Vienna. Maria Theresa, horrified by the situation, sent increasingly desperate messages to her daughter. The Empress feared that if Marie Antoinette could not produce an heir, the marriage might be annulled, and decades of diplomatic work would be destroyed. She urged her daughter to be more attentive to Louis, to try harder to please him, to somehow make the marriage work. But Marie Antoinette had her own frustrations. She was young, lonely, and increasingly isolated at the French court. The rigid etiquette of Versailles was suffocating. Every moment of her day was choreographed and observed. She had to dress and undress in front of courtiers. She had to eat her meals on public display. She could not even write a letter without someone watching. The Austrian ambassador, Comte de Mercy-Argenteau, kept her under constant surveillance and reported everything back to Vienna. Making matters worse, Marie Antoinette faced hostility from many quarters at court. France had not forgotten its centuries of enmity with Austria, and many nobles viewed her with suspicion. They mockingly called her l'Autrichienne, which meant the Austrian woman, but sounded like l'autre chienne, meaning the other bitch. This nasty wordplay followed her throughout her time in France. One particular source of tension was Madame du Barry, the official mistress of King Louis XV. Du Barry was a woman of humble origins who had risen to power through her relationship with the king. Marie Antoinette was instructed by the highest-ranking women at court, Louis XV's daughters, to completely ignore du Barry. The royal princesses despised the mistress and taught Marie Antoinette to treat her as invisible. For months, Marie Antoinette refused to acknowledge du Barry's existence, would not speak to her, would not even look at her. This became a diplomatic crisis. King Louis XV was devoted to du Barry and offended by the treatment of his mistress. At the time, France and Austria were in the process of dividing Poland between them, and Louis XV refused to sign the necessary documents as long as his mistress felt slighted. Maria Theresa, exasperated, wrote to her daughter asking if it would really be so difficult to simply say hello to the woman. Finally, on January 1, 1772, Marie Antoinette approached Du Barry at a gathering and uttered a single neutral sentence. "There are a lot of people at Versailles today." This banal comment satisfied Du Barry, pleased Louis XV, and allowed the political negotiations to proceed, but it demonstrated how every personal interaction at Versailles carried political weight. In 1774, everything changed. On May 10th, King Louis XV died of smallpox. Louis Auguste, still only 19 years old, ascended to the throne as King Louis XVI. Marie Antoinette, not yet 20, became Queen of France. This should have been a moment of triumph, but the fundamental problem remained. 4 years into their marriage, they still had no children. The pressure intensified. In 1777, Marie Antoinette's brother, Joseph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, decided to intervene personally. Joseph travelled to France under the assumed name of Count Falkenstein to preserve his freedom of movement. He met with his sister, who poured out her heart to him about her miserable situation. He also spoke privately with Louis XVI. The exact content of their conversation remains unknown, but Joseph later wrote to his brother Leopold describing Louis and Marie Antoinette as two complete blunderers. Joseph explained to them, apparently in explicit detail, exactly what they were supposed to be doing. Some historians believe he also recommended that Louis undergo a minor surgical procedure, though this remains controversial. Other historians argue that the problem was simply ignorance, and that Joseph's frank discussion was sufficient. Whatever advice Joseph gave, it worked. On August 18, 1777, more than 7 years after their wedding, the marriage was finally consummated. Louis wrote to Joseph thanking him for his help and expressing hope that within a year, Joseph would have a nephew or niece. 8 months later, in April 1778, it was announced that the Queen was pregnant. On December 19, 1778, Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Marie-Thérèse Charlotte. The birth was difficult. So many courtiers crowded into the birthing room, as was custom, that Marie Antoinette fainted from lack of air. Louis frantically ordered the windows opened and cleared the room. When Marie Antoinette learned that her child was a girl, she reportedly said, "Poor little girl, you are not what was desired, but you are no less dear to me on that account. A son would have been the property of the state. You shall be mine." This comment revealed something important about Marie Antoinette's character. Despite all the pressure to produce a male heir, she felt genuine tenderness toward her daughter. She was determined to be an involved mother, far more so than was typical for queens of her era. The Palace of Versailles, where Marie Antoinette now reigned as queen, was one of the most magnificent structures in the world. Originally built as a hunting lodge, it had been transformed by Louis XIV into an immense palace that served as both the seat of government and a monument to royal power. The palace contained hundreds of rooms, elaborate gardens stretching for miles, and a permanent population of thousands of courtiers, servants, and officials. Life at Versailles was governed by an extraordinarily complex system of etiquette. Every action, from waking in the morning to retiring at night, was regulated by rigid protocols. The Queen's day began with the lever, the waking ceremony. Dozens of courtiers would crowd into her bedchamber to watch her get dressed. Different nobles had some specific rights to hand her different articles of clothing. The Duchesse de Chartres had the honour of holding her chemise. The Dame d'honneur had the right to hand her the petticoat. If a princess of the blood arrived while the Queen was dressing, all the garments would have to be passed back through the hierarchy of rank until the princess could hand them to the Queen. This could take an hour or more, with Marie Antoinette standing partially clothed in the cold while courtiers argued about precedence. Marie Antoinette hated this system. She had been raised in the Habsburg court, where etiquette was far less rigid. The formality and constant observation at Versailles felt oppressive to her. She began to seek ways to escape it. Fortunately, shortly after Louis XVI became king, he gave her a gift that would allow her some measure of freedom. He gave her the Petit Trianon. The Petit Trianon was a small chateau located on the grounds of Versailles, but far enough from the main palace to feel separate. It had been built by Louis XV for his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, though she died before it was completed. It was then occupied by Du Barry. When Louis XVI gave it to his wife, he gave her complete control over it. No one could enter the grounds without the Queen's permission. A small sign at the entrance read, "De par la Reine," by order of the Queen. At the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette created her own private world. She decorated the rooms according to her personal taste, filling them with delicate furniture, pastoral paintings, and hondeos and her favourite flowers. She had the gardens redesigned into the English style, with winding paths, artificial streams, and carefully arranged natural landscapes. She built a small theatre where she and her friends could perform plays, and perhaps most controversially, she commissioned the construction of the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet. The hamlet was an artificial village designed to look like a rustic Norman farm. It included thatched roof cottages, a working dairy, a mill, and even livestock. Marie Antoinette would dress into simple cotton gowns, rather than the elaborate silk court dresses, and pretend to be a shepherdess. She would take her children there and let them play in ways that would have been impossible at the formal palace. To her, this was a harmless fantasy, a way to experience something approximating normal life. But to many observers, the hamlet seemed like an offensive mockery. While peasants across France were starving, struggling to feed their families on near-empty harvests, the Queen was playing at being a peasant. The elaborate rustic simplicity of the hamlet had cost a fortune to construct. The carefully designed natural landscapes required constant maintenance by armies of gardeners. Marie Antoinette's pastoral fantasies were seen as evidence of her complete disconnect from reality. At the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette surrounded herself with a small circle of favourites. Her closest friend was the Princesse de Lamballe, a sweet-natured widow who showed Marie Antoinette genuine affection. Later, Marie Antoinette became extremely close to the Duchesse de Polignac, a charming woman from a relatively minor noble family. When the governess of the royal children resigned, Marie Antoinette appointed Polignac to this prestigious position despite the Duchess's modest birth. This caused scandal at court, where many higher-ranking women felt they deserved the position. The Polignac family benefited enormously from royal favour. They received pensions, positions, and properties. Their sudden wealth and lavish lifestyle caused resentment among other noble families. But Marie Antoinette trusted Polignac completely and valued her companionship. The Queen also included several men among her circle of intimates at the Petit Trianon. This was controversial, as it violated court protocol. Rumours began to spread about improper relationships, though there is little evidence to support these accusations. Marie Antoinette's spending during these years became legendary. She loved beautiful things, elaborate gowns, sparkling jewellery, fine furniture, and decorative objects. She commissioned work from the finest craftsmen in France. Jean-Henri Riesner created exquisite furniture for her. She patronised the portrait painter Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, whose career flourished under royal favour. Vigée-Lebrun painted numerous portraits of the Queen, including some that caused scandal. One particularly controversial portrait showed Marie Antoinette wearing a simple white muslin dress and a straw hat, the kind of casual clothing she wore at the Petit Trianon. When the painting was exhibited at the Salon of 1783, it caused an uproar. Critics said it was inappropriate for the Queen of France to be depicted in her undergarments, as that was essentially what the simple white dress represented. The painting had to be replaced with a more conventional portrait showing the Queen in formal court dress. Marie Antoinette's fashion choices influenced women throughout Europe. She popularised enormous hairstyles called poufs, which could rise 3 or 4 feet above the head. These elaborate constructions were built on wire frames and decorated with feathers, flowers, ribbons, and even small mechanical ships or bird cages. The poufs required hours to construct and were extremely uncomfortable. Women who wore them had trouble fitting through doorways or getting into carriages. The Queen also had a significant impact on French culture more broadly. She loved opera and ballet, and her patronage helped determine which works were performed at court. She supported composers like Gluck and Grétry. She played the harp and harpsichord herself and enjoyed organising musical evenings. She encouraged the performance of Pierre Beaumarchais' play, The Marriage of Figaro, at court, despite its satirical treatment of the nobility. The play was immensely popular and would later be adapted by Mozart into one of his greatest operas. Through all of this, Marie Antoinette was developing a reputation. To some, she was a queen of exquisite taste, a patron of the arts, and a woman who brought elegance and refinement to the French court. To others, she was Madame Deficit, a spendthrift who was bankrupting France through her extravagance. In reality, Marie Antoinette's personal spending, while certainly lavish, was only a tiny fraction of France's massive national debt. The debt had been accumulated over decades through expensive wars and inefficient government. But Marie Antoinette made a convenient scapegoat. Marie Antoinette's greatest joy came from her children. After the difficult birth of her daughter Marie-Thérèse in 1778, she became pregnant again in 1781. On October 22nd of that year, she gave birth to a son, Louis-Joseph Jévier-François. The birth of a male heir was cause for immense celebration. Cannons fired from the palace, bells rang throughout Paris, and the king distributed gifts to the poor. Louis XVI had reportedly told his wives, "Madame, you have fulfilled my wishes and those of France, but you are the mother of a dauphin." Young Louis-Joseph, as the eldest son of the king, received the title of dauphin, meaning he was heir to the throne. Marie Antoinette doted on him. She insisted on nursing her children herself when possible, rather than sending them away to wet nurses as was customary. She spent hours playing with them, reading to them, and supervising their education. She commissioned numerous portraits of herself with her children, wanting to present herself to France as a devoted mother. In March 1785, Marie Antoinette gave birth to a second son, Louis Charles. He was initially titled the Duke of Normandy. He was a healthy, handsome baby with bright blue eyes. Then in July 1786, she gave birth to a daughter, Sophie Hélène Beatrix. But Sophie was born prematurely and was weak from birth. Despite the Queen's desperate efforts to save her, little Sophie died in June 1787 when she was not quite 11 months old. This was Marie Antoinette's first experience with the death of a child, and it devastated her. But a greater tragedy was looming. The Dauphin, Louis-Joseph, who had seemed healthy as a baby, began to show signs of illness as he grew older. By the time he was 3 years old, he was experiencing high fevers. He was moved to various residences where the air was supposed to be better for his health, but he continued to decline. His spine began to curve abnormally, forcing him to wear painful corsets to try to correct the deformity. Her one shoulder grew higher than the other. He had difficulty breathing and could not play with other children. Marie Antoinette watched her beloved son slowly waste away. She wrote letters describing her anguish as Louis-Joseph's condition deteriorated. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis of the bone, a painful and ultimately fatal disease. The boy was moved to the Château de Meudon, where doctors hoped the cleaner air might help him, but it was clear by 1788 that he would not survive. On June 4th, 1789, a 7-year-old Louis-Joseph died in his mother's arms at 1 o'clock in the morning. Louis XVI had visited his son the previous day, but had returned to Versailles to meet with political delegations. When a group from the National Assembly demanded an audience with the king on the day of his son's death, Louis cried out, "Are there no fathers in the Assembly?" The timing of the Dauphin's death could not have been worse. The Estates General, an assembly of representatives from the clergy, nobility and common people, had just been convened for the first time in over a century. France was in political crisis. The common people were suffering from bread shortages after years of poor harvests. There was widespread anger at the monarchy and aristocracy. And at this crucial moment, when the king and queen should have been focused on political matters, they were grief-stricken over their son's death. Marie Antoinette later wrote bitterly that at the death of her poor little Dauphin, the nation hardly seemed to notice. The French people, preoccupied with their own suffering and preparing for political change, had little sympathy for the royal family's loss. The title of Dauphin now passed to 4-year-old Louis Charles, who suddenly found himself heir to a throne that was beginning to shake on its foundations. Before examining the revolution that would destroy Marie Antoinette, we must understand an earlier scandal that severely damaged her reputation and made her a target of public hatred. This was the affair of the diamond necklace, one of the most spectacular fraud cases in French history. The story begins in 1772, when 2 Parisian jewellers, Charles Auguste Baumer and Paul Bassange, began work on an extraordinary diamond necklace. They intended to sell it to King Louis V as a gift for his mistress, Madame du Barry. The necklace was designed to be the most magnificent piece of jewellery ever created. It contained 647 diamonds weighing nearly 2,800 carats. The diamonds were arranged in multiple strands, with elaborate festoons and pendants. The necklace took years to complete and cost the jewellers a fortune to assemble. But before the necklace was finished, Louis XV died. His grandson Louis XVI was not interested in buying an extravagant necklace, especially not one associated with his grandfather's mistress. The jewellers were left with an unsellable masterpiece and enormous debts. They approached Marie Antoinette multiple times, hoping she would purchase it, but she refused. She knew the necklace's history and did not want it. Moreover, France was facing serious financial problems, and the necklace cost 1,600,000 livres, roughly equivalent to $15 million today. It was an impossible expense. The jewellers were desperate. They had invested everything in this necklace and were facing bankruptcy. Enter Jeanne de Valois Saint-Remy, who styled herself the Comtesse de la Motte. Jeanne was an impoverished descendant of an illegitimate line of the Valois royal family. She had a difficult childhood and grew up feeling that she had been cheated of her rightful place in society. She was intelligent, ambitious, and completely unscrupulous. She was also an extraordinarily skilled confidence artist. Jeanne had managed to gain a position at court and had become the mistress of Cardinal Louis de Rohan. The cardinal was a powerful prelate who had served as French ambassador to Vienna. While in Vienna, he had offended Empress Maria Theresa with his licentious behaviour, and Marie Antoinette, following her mother's lead, had excluded him from her inner circle. Rohan desperately wanted to regain royal favour, and Jeanne promised she could help him. Jeanne began by claiming to be a close friend of the Queen. She told Rohan that Marie Antoinette had noticed his attempts to reconcile and was softening toward him. She arranged for a supposed secret correspondence between the cardinal and the Queen. The letters were actually written by Jeanne and her lover, a forger named Rétaux de Villette, but Rohan believed they were authentic. The letters suggested that the Queen was grateful for his loyalty and hoped to show him favour. To make the deception more convincing, Jeanne arranged a midnight meeting in the gardens of Versailles. She hired a prostitute named Nicole de Liva, who resembled Marie Antoinette, to meet with Rohan in the dark. During this brief encounter, the Queen thanked Rohan for his devotion and hinted that better times were coming. Rohan was thrilled. He believed he had been forgiven and was on the verge of returning to favour. Now came the main scheme. Jeanne told Rohan that the Queen desperately wanted the famous diamond necklace but could not be seen purchasing it during such difficult economic times. She needed someone to buy it on her behalf secretly, and she had chosen Rohan for this honour. She showed him forged letters from the Queen explaining the arrangement. The necklace would be purchased with payments made in instalments, and Rohan would serve as the intermediary. Rohan, blinded by ambition and convinced of the authenticity of the correspondence, agreed. On February 1st, 1785, he met with the jewellers and signed a contract to purchase the necklace on behalf of the Queen. The contract stipulated payment in 4 instalments over 2 years. The jewellers, delighted to finally sell their masterpiece, handed over the necklace. Rohan immediately delivered it to Jeanne de la Motte, who claimed she would give it to the Queen. Instead, Jeanne and her husband took the necklace to London, where they broke it apart and sold the individual diamonds. They became suddenly spectacularly wealthy. They purchased property and lived lavishly. Meanwhile, the first payment came due. When the jewellers received nothing, they began to worry. They tried to approach the Queen directly to inquire about the payment. When they finally managed to speak with her in July 1785, Marie Antoinette had no idea what they were talking about. She had never agreed to purchase any necklace. The scandal exploded. It became clear that Cardinal Rohan had been the victim of an elaborate fraud, but it also became apparent that he had been extraordinarily gullible. How could a prince of the church, a sophisticated man who had served as an ambassador, have believed that the Queen of France would conduct secret negotiations to buy jewellery through clandestine letters and midnight meetings in gardens? The entire affair made him look foolish, but it made Marie Antoinette look even worse. Louis XVI, furious at the cardinal's presumption in believing the Queen would deal with him secretly, insisted that Rohan be arrested and tried. On August 15, 1785, in a scene of high drama, Cardinal Rohan was arrested while dressed in his full ceremonial robes as Grand Almoner of France, preparing to celebrate Mass at Versailles. He was taken to the Bastille prison. Jeanne de la Motte was also arrested, as were several others involved in the scheme. The trial took place before the Parlement of Paris, the highest court in France. Marie Antoinette was not formally a party to the trial, but everyone knew the case revolved around her reputation. The cardinal's defence was simple. He had been deceived by criminals who exploited his devotion to the crown. Jeanne de la Motte's defence was more audacious. She claimed that Marie Antoinette had actually been involved in the scheme. She suggested that the Queen really had wanted the necklace and had used Jeanne as an intermediary, then betrayed her when the affair became public. There was no evidence whatsoever to support Jeanne's claims, but the accusation itself was damaging. The trial became a sensation. Pamphlets circulated throughout Paris discussing the case and speculating about the Queen's involvement. Public opinion, already suspicious of Marie Antoinette's spending habits, was inclined to believe the worst. Many people thought that even if the Queen had not actually commissioned the purchase, her reputation for extravagance made the story plausible. On May 31st, 1786, the Parlement delivered its verdict. Cardinal Rohan was acquitted of all charges. The court found that he had been the victim of fraud and bore no criminal responsibility. Jeanne de la Motte was found guilty and sentenced to be publicly whipped, branded with a V for volus, thief, and imprisoned for life. Her husband, who had fled to London, was convicted in absentia. The forger Rétaux de Villette was banished. The prostitute Nicole d'Oliva was acquitted, as the court determined she had been an unwitting pawn. Marie Antoinette should have been vindicated by the verdict, which clearly established that she had never been involved in any way with the necklace scheme. But the acquittal of Cardinal Rohan was seen as a humiliation for the Queen. The Parlement, by clearing Rohan, had implicitly criticised the King and Queen for prosecuting him. Public celebrations broke out when Rohan was freed. People cheered him as though he were a hero who had been persecuted by a vengeful queen. The aftermath of the diamond necklace affair was devastating for Marie Antoinette's reputation. Pornographic pamphlets began circulating, depicting her in obscene situations. These publications suggested she had numerous lovers, both male and female. They described elaborate orgies at the Petit Trianon. They accused her of every possible sexual excess. The pamphlets were crude, vicious, and completely false, but they were widely read and believed. The nickname Madame Deficit became more common. She was blamed for France's financial crisis, even though her personal spending was insignificant compared to the cost of France's military ventures and the inefficient tax system. She became a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy: waste, corruption, foreign influence, and decadence. She was l'Autrichienne, the foreigner who had never truly become French, who cared nothing for the suffering of the French people. This public hatred would have deadly consequences. When the revolution came, the accumulated resentment and suspicion surrounding Marie Antoinette made her a natural target. The diamond necklace affair had not created these negative feelings, but it had crystallized them and given them concrete expression. It had made the Queen into a villain in the public imagination, a role from which she would never escape. In the late 1780s, France was on the brink of catastrophe. The government was essentially bankrupt, crippled by debts accumulated through decades of expensive wars, particularly French support for the American Revolution. The taxation system was fundamentally unjust. The clergy and nobility were largely exempt from taxes, while the common people bore the heavy burden. Agricultural yields had been poor for several years, resulting in bread shortages and soaring prices. Workers in cities could barely afford to feed their families. In the countryside, peasants were starving. King Louis XVI and his ministers recognized that fundamental reforms were necessary. The Compte Général, a financial report published in 1781, had revealed the extent of the government's debt. Various finance ministers proposed solutions, including taxing the nobility and clergy, but these reforms were blocked by privileged groups who refused to surrender their exemptions. The political system seemed incapable of addressing the crisis. In August 1788, the king made a fateful decision. He announced that the Estates General would be convened in May 1789. The Estates General was an assembly of representatives from the three estates of French society: the First Estate clergy, the Second Estate nobility, and the Third Estate everyone else. It had not met since 1614, 175 years earlier. Its convocation was an admission that the monarchy could no longer govern alone. The election of representatives and the preparation of grievance lists called cahiers de doléances consumed the winter and spring of 1789. When the Estates General finally assembled at Versailles on May 5, 1789, there were approximately 600 representatives of the Third Estate, 300 of the nobility, and 300 of the clergy. The opening ceremony was magnificent, but also revealed the deep social divisions. The Third Estate representatives wore plain black suits. The nobility wore elaborate costumes of silk and gold. The king and queen appeared in full royal regalia. From the beginning, the Estates General was paralysed by disputes over voting procedures. Traditionally, each estate voted as a bloc. meaning the first and second estates could always outvote the third estate 2-1. The third estate demanded that all representatives vote individually, which would give them numerical superiority. When the king and nobility refused, the third estate took revolutionary action. On June 17, 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly and claimed to represent the nation as a whole. 3 days later, finding their meeting hall locked, the representatives of the National Assembly moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. There they swore the tennis court oath, pledging not to separate until they had written a constitution for France. Louis XVI, uncertain how to respond, eventually backed down and ordered the nobility and clergy to join the National Assembly. But he also began moving troops toward Paris and Versailles. During these crucial days in June 1789, Marie Antoinette was consumed by grief over the recent death of her son, the Dauphin Louis Joseph. She was in no condition to provide political counsel, and Louis XVI was indecisive by nature. The king wavered between conciliation and repression, taking no clear course of action. This vacuum of leadership allowed events to spiral out of control. On July 11th, the king dismissed Jacques Necker, his popular finance minister. News of Necker's dismissal reached Paris on July the 12th and was interpreted as a sign that the king intended to dissolve the National Assembly by force. Parisians, already anxious about the presence of troops around the city, panicked. Riots broke out. People armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find. On July the 14th, 1789, a crowd stormed the Bastille prison, seeking gunpowder and ammunition stored there. The fall of the Bastille was more symbolic than militarily significant. The prison held only 7 prisoners at the time, but it represented royal authority and oppression. Its capture by the people marked the beginning of the revolution in earnest. When Louis XVI heard the news, he reportedly asked, "Is this a revolt?" The bearer of the news replied, "No, sire, it is a revolution." In the following weeks, the old order began to collapse. In the countryside, peasants attacked noble estates in what became known as the Great Fear, burning records of feudal obligations. In Paris, the National Assembly began systematically dismantling the structures of the old regime. On August 4th, in a remarkable night session, noble representatives renounced their feudal privileges. On August 26th, the Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, proclaiming that all men were born free and equal in rights. Marie Antoinette watched these events with growing horror. She recognized that the world she had known was disappearing. She began to take a more active role in trying to shape the king's response to the crisis. She urged him to be firm, to resist the Assembly's most radical demands. She wrote letters to her family in Austria, begging them to send help. But Austria was preoccupied with wars against the Ottoman Empire and could offer little assistance. On October 1st, 1789, a banquet was held at Versailles for the Royal Flanders Regiment, troops who had been called to protect the royal family. During the banquet, officers reportedly drank toasts to the king and queen while trampling the revolutionary tricolour cockade underfoot. When word of this banquet reached Paris, it caused outrage. Already angry about bread shortages, Parisians were inflamed by what they saw as contempt for the revolution. On the morning of October 5th, 1789, a crowd of women from the Paris marketplaces began to gather. They were angry about the high price and scarcity of bread. The crowd grew throughout the day, eventually numbering in the thousands. They decided to march to Versailles to confront the king. They set out in the rain, a ragged army of women armed with knives, pikes, and muskets, determined to bring the royal family to Paris. Marie Antoinette was at the Petit Trianon when news of the approaching mob reached Versailles. She hurried back to the palace. By evening, approximately 7,000 women had arrived at Versailles, along with the Marquis de Lafayette and the National Guard of Paris. The women surrounded the palace, chanting and demanding bread. A delegation was allowed to meet with the king. Louis promised to ensure Paris received bread and agreed to sign the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which he had been refusing to approve. During the night, the situation grew more dangerous. At dawn on October the 6th, some members of the crowd found an unlocked entrance to the palace. They rushed inside, searching for the Queen's apartments. Guards were killed trying to defend the doorways. Marie Antoinette, awakened by the commotion, barely escaped. She fled through a secret passage to the king's chambers, running in her nightgown with her ladies-in-waiting. If she had been seconds slower, she would have been caught and almost certainly killed. The crowd was now inside the palace, and the situation was on the verge of becoming a massacre. Lafayette eventually managed to restore some order. He convinced Louis XVI to appear on a balcony and address the crowd. The king promised to come to Paris. Then Lafayette brought Marie Antoinette onto the balcony. The crowd shouted threats and insults. Some raised their weapons. Lafayette, in a gesture of chivalry, kissed the queen's hand. This act of respect from the popular general momentarily calmed the mob. But the crowd's demand was clear. The royal family must leave Versailles and come to live in Paris, where the people could watch them. Louis XVI had no choice but to agree. That afternoon, the royal family climbed into their carriage. They were accompanied by a vast crowd, an ominous procession that took 6 hours to travel the 12 miles from Versailles to Paris. Women carried pikes with the heads of murdered guards stuck on them. The crowd sang and chanted. They shouted that they were bringing the baker, the baker's wife and the baker's boy to Paris, as if the king's presence would somehow make bread appear. The royal family was installed in the Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris. The Tuileries had not been properly maintained and was in poor condition, a stark contrast to the splendour of Versailles. More significantly, the family was now prisoners. They could not leave without permission. They were under constant surveillance. Every action was monitored. The age of Versailles, with all its excesses and freedoms, was over. Life at the Tuileries was a strange mixture of maintained formality and real imprisonment. The royal family continued to observe court etiquette. They attended mass in the palace chapel. They ate elaborate meals, but they were surrounded by guards and could not leave the grounds without National Guard escorts. Marie Antoinette tried to maintain some semblance of normal life for her children. Young Louis Charles, who had become Dauphin after his brother's death, and his sister Marie-Thérèse tried to play in the palace gardens, but even this simple pleasure was conducted under watch. Marie Antoinette's role in these months is controversial. She was in secret correspondence with her family in Austria, and with various nobles who had fled France and were organising opposition to the revolution from abroad. She urged these émigrés to organise military intervention. She also participated in political discussions with Louis XVI's ministers, pushing for resistance to the National Assembly's more radical measures. Whether these actions represented principled defence of monarchy or obstruction of necessary reforms depends on one's perspective. The National Assembly continued its work of transforming France. The old provinces were replaced by new administrative departments. Church property was confiscated and sold to pay the national debt. A civil constitution of the clergy was passed, making priests employees of the state who would be elected by citizens and required to swear loyalty to the constitution. This last measure deeply troubled Louis XVI, who was sincerely religious. He was torn between his political situation and his conscience. In April 1791, the royal family planned to travel to Saint-Cloud, a palace near Paris, for Easter. Louis wanted to attend mass said by a non-juring priest, one who refused to swear the constitutional oath. But when the royal carriage prepared to leave the Tuileries, a crowd surrounded it and would not let it pass. For hours, Louis and Marie Antoinette sat in their carriage, while the mob shouted insults and prevented their departure. National Guard soldiers, officially there to protect the king, did nothing to help. Eventually, the family had to return to the palace humiliated. This incident made it clear that they were not merely supervised but truly imprisoned. This experience convinced Louis and Marie Antoinette that they needed to escape. Secret plans were made. The Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, a longtime friend of Marie Antoinette who was rumoured to be her lover, helped organise the escape attempt. The plan was to travel east to the fortress town of Montmy near the Austrian-Netherlands border, where loyal troops were stationed. From there, Louis could negotiate with the revolutionaries from a position of strength, or if necessary, flee France entirely. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the escape began. Members of the royal family slipped out of the Tuileries in disguise. Marie Antoinette dressed as a governess. The king wore the clothes of a valet. The children were disguised as well. They met Fersen, who had arranged a large Berlin carriage for the journey. Everything initially went smoothly. They made it out of Paris and began the journey eastward. But the plan was flawed from the start. The large, heavy berlin was slow and conspicuous. The family was travelling with too much baggage, including a travelling case containing dishes and utensils. They stopped frequently. Louis insisted on travelling in some comfort and refused to rush. Most critically, they were supposed to meet military escorts at several points along the route, but the schedules were confused. At Saint-Menehould, a small town about 30 miles from their destination, they were recognised. Jean-Baptiste Drouet, the postmaster of Sainte-Menehould, noticed the elaborate carriage and suspicious passengers. He examined them closely and believed he recognised the king from his portrait on the French currency. Drouet raced ahead to the next town, Varennes, to raise the alarm. When the royal family's carriage arrived in Varennes late in the evening of June 21st, they found the bridge blocked. Townspeople surrounded the carriage. The royal family was taken to the home of the local prosecutor and held there while messengers were sent to Paris. The National Assembly dispatched representatives to bring the royal family back. The return journey was a nightmare. Angry crowds lined the route, shouting insults and threats. The family travelled in oppressive heat. They feared being lynched at any moment. It took 4 days to return to Paris. When they finally arrived at the Tuileries on June 25th, they were met by an ominous silence. The Parisians who lined the streets had been ordered not to cheer or jeer, creating an eerie quiet that was more frightening than hostility. The failed flight to Varennes was a catastrophe for the monarchy. It destroyed any remaining trust between the king and the revolutionaries. Louis had left behind a declaration explaining that he felt he could not govern freely while held in Paris, and that many of the revolutionary measures had been forced upon him against his will. This document, found after his departure, proved that he had been lying when he claimed to support the revolution. The fiction that the king was willingly cooperating with constitutional reform was shattered. The National Assembly faced a dilemma. They had been working on a constitution that maintained the monarchy, with Louis as a constitutional king. But Louis had just tried to escape and reject that very constitution. Some radical groups called for the king to be put on trial, or even for France to become a republic. But the majority of the assembly members still believed they needed a king, and decided to maintain the fiction of royal consent. They announced that the king had been kidnapped by enemies of the revolution, absolving him of blame. Louis was required to swear acceptance of the new constitution, which he did in September 1791. But everyone knew the truth. The king was now an open prisoner. Security at the Tuileries was increased. Marie Antoinette was watched even more closely. Radical newspapers published vicious attacks on her, calling her the Austrian bitch and accusing her of plotting against France with foreign powers. These accusations were not entirely false. Marie Antoinette was indeed in correspondence with Austria and hoped for foreign intervention to restore royal power. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria. This decision was supported by strange political bedfellows for very different reasons. The revolutionary Girondins wanted war because they believed it would expose traitors within France and spread revolutionary ideals across Europe. The royal court wanted war because they hoped France would lose and foreign armies would restore the old order. Marie Antoinette secretly sent military plans to the Austrians, an act of treason that would later be used against her. The war initially went badly for France. The French army was in disarray. Many aristocratic officers had emigrated, and the soldiers were poorly trained and equipped. Austrian and Prussian forces advanced into French territory. In July 1792, the Duke of Brunswick, commanding the Allied armies, issued a manifesto threatening terrible consequences if any harm came to the French royal family. This manifesto, probably written with input from French émigrés, had the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than intimidating the revolutionaries, it inflamed them. If foreign powers were threatening France to protect the king and queen, then clearly the king and queen were enemies of France. Throughout the summer of 1792, the political situation in Paris became increasingly radical. A new revolutionary government, the Paris Commune, gained power. Revolutionary sans-culottes, the working-class men who wore trousers rather than aristocratic knee breeches, became a powerful force. They were demanding more extreme measures against the monarchy and aristocracy. On August 10, 1792, a massive crowd of Parisians and provincial volunteers marched on the Tuileries Palace. The Swiss guards defending the palace were prepared to resist. Louis XVI, indecisive as always, first ordered the guards to hold their fire, then changed his mind. In the confusion, fighting broke out. The Swiss guards fired on the crowd, killing many. The enraged mob overwhelmed the defenders. Hundreds of Swiss guards were massacred, some killed after they had already surrendered. The palace was sacked. The royal family was not present for this violence. Earlier in the day, Louis had made the decision to seek protection from the Legislative Assembly, the government body that had replaced the National Assembly. The family walked across the Tuileries gardens to the nearby manège, where the assembly met. They were placed in a small box reserved for stenographers, where they spent hours listening to debates about their fate. Finally, it was decided that the king would be suspended from his functions and that the royal family would be imprisoned in the Temple, a medieval fortress in Paris. The temple had originally been built by the Knights Templar and had later served various purposes. It consisted of a large tower and several smaller buildings within a walled enclosure. The royal family was confined to the large tower. They were given several rooms on different floors, but the conditions were harsh. Windows were barred. Guards watched them constantly. Their possessions were searched. Every letter, every conversation, every action was monitored. Despite the grim circumstances, the family tried to maintain some semblance of normal routine. Louis continued to educate his son, teaching him human geography and Latin. Marie Antoinette taught her daughter embroidery and supervised the children's reading. They played games with cards and simple toys. Louis's sister, Madame Elisabeth, who had voluntarily joined the family in prison out of loyalty, helped care for the children. These months in the temple, though filled with fear and uncertainty, were perhaps the last time the family was together. The political situation outside continued to deteriorate. France had declared war on Austria in April 1792 and now faced a coalition of European powers determined to crush the revolution. Initially, the French armies suffered defeats. Prussian and Austrian forces invaded France. In early September 1792, news reached Paris that the fortress of Verdun had fallen. Panic spread. Radical revolutionaries, led by figures like Jean-Paul Marat and Jacques Hébert, called for drastic measures against internal enemies. What followed were the September massacres, days of mob violence in which approximately 1,200 prisoners were dragged from jails and brutally murdered. Among the victims was the Princesse de Lamballe, Marie Antoinette's dear friend who had remained loyal to her throughout the revolution. Lamballe had been imprisoned separately and was brought before a makeshift tribunal. When she refused to swear an oath denouncing the monarchy, she was handed over to the mob. They killed her with pikes and axes, then mutilated her body. They cut off her head, placed it on a pike, and paraded it through the streets. The mob brought the head to the Temple prison and held it up outside Marie Antoinette's window, forcing her to look at the severed head of her friend. Marie Antoinette fainted at the sight. The guards laughed. This act of cruelty demonstrated the depths of hatred directed at the royal family and the complete breakdown of civilized restraint. On September 21, 1792, the National Convention, which had replaced the Legislative Assembly, formally abolished the monarchy. France was now a republic. Louis was no longer king, but simply Louis Capet, citizen. His trial began in December 1792. The charges included conspiracy with foreign powers, attempting to flee the country, and ordering troops to fire on citizens. The evidence included the iron safe discovered at the Tuileries, which contained documents showing Louis's secret correspondence with foreign monarchs and his real opinion of the revolution. Louis conducted himself with dignity during the trial. He had competent lawyers who mounted a vigorous defense, but the outcome was never really in doubt. On January 15, 1793, the convention voted on Louis's guilt. The vote was nearly unanimous. Guilty. The question then became the sentence. Many argued for imprisonment or exile, but the radical Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, insisted on death. The final vote on execution was close, 361 in favour, 360 opposed. One vote made the difference. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was taken to what was then called the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde. He was executed by guillotine before a vast crowd. Marie Antoinette learned of her husband's death from the guards at the temple. She collapsed in grief. She dressed herself and her children in black mourning clothes. For days, she barely spoke or ate. She refused to leave her room to walk in the garden because doing so would require her to pass by Louis's empty chambers. Her son, Louis Charles, now 8 years old, was recognised by royalists as King Louis XVII of France, though the revolutionaries would never acknowledge this title. To them, he was simply the Capet boy. The spring and summer of 1793 were the darkest period of Marie Antoinette's life. She remained imprisoned in the temple with her children and sister-in-law, but she knew that her own trial would come eventually. The radical Jacobins had gained complete control of the government. Under the leadership of Robespierre, the Committee of Public Safety began the period that became known as the Reign of Terror. Thousands of people were arrested on suspicion of counter-revolutionary activities. The Revolutionary Tribunal sent people to the guillotine daily. Marie Antoinette's hair, which had once been the subject of elaborate styling and decoration, had turned completely white from stress. She was only 37 years old, but looked much older. She was described as pale, thin, and prematurely aged. She suffered from hemorrhaging, likely due to uterine cancer, though this was not diagnosed at the time. She was in constant physical pain, but tried to hide her suffering from her children. On July 3, 1793, commissioners from the Paris Commune arrived at the temple in the middle of the night. They had orders to separate young Louis Charles from his mother and sister. The boy was to be placed under the guardianship of Antoine Simon, a cobbler and loyal revolutionary, who would re-educate him and strip him of his royal identity. Marie Antoinette fought desperately to keep her son. She physically held on to the child, refusing to let the commissioners take him. The struggle went on for over an hour. Marie Antoinette pleaded, begged, and screamed. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse tried to help her mother hold on to the boy. Madame Elisabeth added her protests, but eventually the commissioners forced their way past the women and tore the crying child from his mother's arms. Louis Charles was taken to a cell on a lower floor of the tower. Marie Antoinette could hear his cries echoing through the building but could not reach him. This separation was designed to be cruel. The revolutionaries knew that nothing would hurt Marie Antoinette more than taking her child. For weeks afterward, she barely ate or slept. She spent hours each day standing at her window, hoping to catch a glimpse of her son in the courtyard below. Sometimes she succeeded in seeing him, but he had been forbidden to acknowledge her. Simon taught the boy revolutionary songs and filled his head with propaganda denouncing the monarchy. The child was forced to repeat that his mother and father had been tyrants who deserved their fate. Worse still, Simon manipulated and abused the vulnerable 8-year-old into making false accusations against his mother. He taught the boy to claim that Marie Antoinette and Madame Elisabeth had sexually abused him. These accusations of incest were completely fabricated, the product of Simon's coaching and the revolutionary leadership's desire to completely destroy Marie Antoinette's reputation. But young Louis Charles, traumatized and confused, repeated what he had been taught to say. These accusations would later be used against Marie Antoinette at her trial. On the night of August 1st to August 2nd, 1993, Marie Antoinette was awakened by guards entering her cell. She was informed that she was being transferred to a different prison. She was given no time to properly say goodbye to her daughter and sister-in-law. She was allowed only to kiss them briefly, and then she was escorted down the dark stairs of the temple. A closed carriage waited in the courtyard. She was driven through the pre-dawn streets of Paris to the Conciergerie, the ancient prison on the Ile de la Cité that was known as the antechamber of the guillotine. Anyone sent to the Conciergerie was almost certain to be executed. The Conciergerie was far more oppressive than the temple. The building was cold, damp, and dark. Marie Antoinette was initially placed in a cell on the ground floor overlooking the women's courtyard. The cell was small, approximately 9 feet by 6 feet, with a vaulted stone ceiling. It contained a narrow bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a screen for privacy. But even this minimal privacy was denied her. 2 gendarmes were posted inside her cell with orders to watch her constantly, day and night. They observed everything she did. She could not dress or undress without them watching. She could not even use the chamber pot in private. This humiliation was deliberate, designed to strip her of the last vestiges of royal dignity. She was not allowed writing materials most of the time, fearing she would send messages to supporters. She was allowed minimal personal possessions. She had a few simple black dresses, undergarments, and stockings. She kept a small prayer book and spent hours reading it. A woman named Rosalie Lamolière, who worked as a servant in the prison, was assigned to bring Marie Antoinette her meals. Rosalie later provided accounts of the Queen's final days, describing her as quiet, dignified, and uncomplaining despite her terrible circumstances. Marie Antoinette thanked Rosalie for every small service and never expressed anger at her captors, though she must have felt it. There were several attempts to rescue Marie Antoinette from the Conciergerie. One plot, called the Carnation Plot, involved a royalist sympathizer named Alexandre de Rougeville. He managed to gain access to Marie Antoinette's cell by bribing a guard. During his visit, he dropped a carnation flower on the floor, inside which was hidden a note proposing an escape plan. Marie Antoinette picked up the flower and later wrote a reply using a pin to prick holes in paper, forming words, but one of the guards, who who had pretended to be bribed but was actually loyal to the revolution, reported the plot. Rougeville escaped, but the guard who had allowed him access was arrested. As a result of this incident, Marie Antoinette was moved to an even worse cell, a former council chamber with no natural light, where security was even tighter. She remained in this cell for 44 days. The Revolutionary Tribunal decided it was time to put Marie Antoinette on trial. The radical journalist Jacques Hébert had been leading a vicious propaganda campaign against her in his newspaper calling for her execution. The Committee of Public Safety, dominated by Robespierre, agreed that the former queen needed to be eliminated. She represented a potential rallying point for counter-revolutionaries, both within France and abroad. Her continued existence was seen as a threat to the Republic. On October the 12th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was awakened at 1 o'clock in the morning and brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal for interrogation. She was questioned about various events during the revolution. She denied all accusations of conspiracy and treason. After several hours, she was formally indicted and sent back to her cell. She was assigned 2 defense lawyers, Claude-François Chauveau-Lagarde and Guillaume Alexandre Tronçon du Coudray. Unlike Louis XVI, who had been given weeks to prepare his defense, Marie Antoinette was given less than 1 day. Her lawyers urged her to request more time to prepare, and she wrote to the tribunal asking for a 3-day delay. Her request was ignored. The trial began on October the 14th, 1793, at 8 o'clock in the morning. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see the former queen brought low. Marie Antoinette entered wearing a simple black dress, a white cap covering her prematurely white hair, and black shoes. She looked pale and ill. Her face showed the strain of months of imprisonment and grief, but she carried herself with dignity. She sat in a chair facing her accusers and prepared to defend herself. The charges against her were read by Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, the public prosecutor of the Revolutionary Tribunal, a man known for his ruthlessness and high conviction rate. The accusations were extensive and damning. She was charged with conspiring with foreign powers, particularly Austria, and transmitting military secrets that aided France's enemies. She was accused of depleting the national treasury through her extravagant spending. She was charged with orchestrating the banquet at Versailles in October 1789, where officers allegedly trampled the revolutionary cockade. She was accused of planning the massacre of Parisians. She was blamed for the attempted escape to Varennes. She was charged with plotting to create civil war within France. 40 witnesses testified against her over the course of 2 days. Many of the witnesses repeated rumours and hearsay. Some claimed to have seen documents proving her correspondence with Austria, though these documents were not produced. Others described luxurious spending at Versailles before the revolution. The testimony was often vague and circumstantial. Marie Antoinette defended herself calmly and intelligently. She pointed out inconsistencies in the testimony. She denied accusations that could be disproven. She refused to answer questions that were based on false premises. Then came the most shocking accusation of all. Jacques Hébert testified that Marie Antoinette had engaged in incestuous sexual relations with her son, Louis Charles. He claimed that the boy himself had confirmed this, having been taught indecent practices by his mother and aunt. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. This accusation was so vile, so beyond the pale, that even some of Marie Antoinette's enemies were uncomfortable. For the first time during the trial, Marie Antoinette showed real emotion. She refused to answer the charge, saying she would leave it to the judgment of all mothers present in the courtroom. Then she stood and addressed the women in the gallery directly, appealing to them as mothers to understand that such an accusation was too horrible to even acknowledge with a response. Her words reportedly moved many women in the audience to tears, and even some of the men present felt that Hébert had gone too far. The trial continued through the day and into the night. The proceedings were exhausting. Marie Antoinette had been given no food except some bouillon that morning and had been sitting in the courtroom for more than 16 hours. Finally, at 4:30 in the morning on October the 16th, the jury was sent to deliberate. They returned after just 1 hour. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by guillotine, to be carried out that same day. Marie Antoinette was returned to her cell at the Conciergerie for a few final hours. She was given paper and ink and wrote a last letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, who remained imprisoned in the Temple with Marie-Thérèse. This letter, which became known as the Testament of the Queen, is one of the most moving documents to survive from the Revolution. In it, Marie Antoinette forgave her enemies and asked her children to do the same. She wrote about her husband and expressed the hope that her daughter would care for her younger brother. She spoke of her Catholic faith and her acceptance of death. She asked her children not to seek revenge for what had been done to their parents. The letter was never delivered. It was confiscated by authorities and would not be made public until many years later. After writing the letter, Marie Antoinette asked for a priest, a constitutional priest, one who had sworn loyalty to the revolutionary government, was sent to her. Marie Antoinette, who remained loyal to the Catholic Church and rejected the civil constitution of the clergy, refused his services. She was denied access to a non-juring priest, so she faced death without the last sacraments, something that would have been deeply painful for a devout Catholic. At 8 o'clock in the morning, guards came to her cell to prepare her for execution. Her hands were bound behind her back. The executioner, Henri Sanson, cut her hair short. This was necessary for the guillotine, but also served as a final humiliation. Her beautiful hair, once styled so elaborately and famously, was roughly shorn. She was not allowed to change into the white dress she'd prepared, the traditional garment for aristocratic executions. Instead, she was forced to wear her simple black dress, like a common criminal. She was led from her cell through the corridors of the Conciergerie. An artist named Jacques-Louis David, who supported the revolution and would later become Napoleon's court painter, had positioned himself to sketch her as she passed. His drawing shows a woman who looks far older than her 37 years. Her face is gaunt, her expression stoic. Her hands are bound behind her back. Her posture remains upright despite everything. At the entrance to the Conciergerie, a tumbril waited, an open wooden cart used for transporting prisoners to execution. This was another deliberate insult. Louis XVI had been transported in a closed carriage, affording him some dignity. Marie Antoinette was placed in an open cart where everyone could see her. Her back was to the horse, forcing her to face the jeering crowds as the cart slowly made its way through the streets. The route from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution was approximately 2 miles. The journey took more than an hour because enormous crowds lined the streets. Some people shouted insults and curses, others watched in silence. The revolutionaries had mobilized soldiers and National Guard units to line the route and prevent any rescue attempt. Drums beat steadily as the cart rolled through the streets. Marie Antoinette sat perfectly still, her eyes focused straight ahead. Rosalie Lamelière, watching from a window, later said that the Queen's face showed no fear, only a kind of distant resignation. The cart passed through the Rue Saint-Honoré, one of the main thoroughfares of Paris. The house where Robespierre lived was on this street. According to some accounts, though this may be apocryphal, Robespierre watched from his window as Marie Antoinette passed. The cart also rolled past the site of the old Tuileries Palace, where Marie Antoinette had spent years of captivity. When the cart finally reached the Place de la Révolution, Marie Antoinette saw the guillotine rising before her. The machine had been used to execute her husband on that same spot 9 months earlier. A vast crowd had gathered to witness her death. The cart stopped, and she was helped down. Her movements were hampered by her bound hands and by weakness. She accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. She immediately said, "Pardon, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." Even in her final moments, her aristocratic training and courtesy manifested itself. These were reportedly her last words. She climbed the steps to the platform. The executioner and his assistants positioned her at the guillotine. She was placed face down, her neck positioned beneath the blade. At 12:15 in the afternoon, the blade fell. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, was dead. Sanson picked up her severed head and displayed it to the crowd. Some people cheered, others stood in shocked silence. One witness later wrote that many of the women in the crowd openly wept, despite having been hostile to Marie Antoinette during her life. Something about seeing her actually killed, seeing her reduced to a bloody corpse, brought home the finality and cruelty of what had been done. Her body was placed in a simple wooden coffin and taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, where it was buried in an unmarked grave covered with quicklime. Years later, during the restoration of the monarchy, her remains and those of Louis XVI were exhumed and reinterred in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of French royalty. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette's family did not end with her death. Her son, Louis Charles, remained imprisoned in the Temple Tower under the custody of Antoine Simon. The boy was subjected to terrible conditions. He was locked in a dark, filthy cell. He was rarely allowed to clean himself or change his clothes. He was given inadequate food. He became ill with tuberculosis. Simon had been teaching him to curse his parents and sing revolutionary songs, but eventually Simon was removed from his position and the boy was left largely alone in his cell. Young Louis Charles died on June 8, 1795, at the age of 10. The official cause of death was tuberculosis, though his brutal treatment undoubtedly hastened his demise. Rumours immediately circulated that the boy who died was not really the Dauphin, that he had somehow been smuggled out and replaced with another child. Over the following decades, more than 100 people claimed to be the lost Louis XVI, but DNA testing performed in 2000 on Louis Charles's preserved heart, which had been removed during the autopsy and kept by the physician, confirmed that the child who died in the temple was indeed Marie Antoinette's son. He had not escaped. He had died in that miserable cell. Marie Antoinette's daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survived. She remained imprisoned in the temple even after her mother's execution. She was utterly alone, having lost her father, mother, brother, and aunt. Madame Elisabeth was executed in May 1704. Marie Thérèse was finally released in December 17 as part of a prisoner exchange with Austria. She was 19 years old. She spent the rest of her life in exile, never returning permanently to France. She married her cousin, the Duc d'Angoulême, but the marriage was unhappy and childless. She became known as Madame Royale and later as the Duchesse d'Angoulême. She witnessed the brief restoration of the Bourbon monarchy but saw it fall again. She died in exile in Austria in 1851 at the age of 72. She never spoke publicly about her years of imprisonment, but those who knew her said the trauma had left permanent scars. Marie Antoinette's legacy is complex and contradictory. She has been portrayed as everything from a foolish, frivolous woman whose selfishness helped bring down the French monarchy to a tragic victim of circumstances beyond her control. Both views contain elements of truth. Marie Antoinette was indeed extravagant and politically naive in her youth. Her spending, while not the cause of France's financial crisis, was symbolically damaging and showed poor judgment. Her interference in politics was often counterproductive. She failed to understand or connect with the French people, remaining always something of a foreigner in France, but she was also a product of her time and upbringing. She was married off at 14 to a stranger for political reasons. She was thrust into one of the most complex and rigid courts in Europe. She was expected to produce heirs while her husband was unable to consummate the marriage for 7 years. She was subjected to constant criticism, surveillance, and gossip. The pornographic pamphlets that circulated about her were vile beyond description, attacking her in the crudest possible terms. She was blamed for France's problems, even though those problems predated her arrival by decades. In her final years, Marie Antoinette showed genuine courage and dignity. Her conduct during her imprisonment, trial, and execution revealed strength of character that had not been evident during her time as queen. She faced her death with remarkable composure. She maintained her dignity even when subjected to the most degrading treatment. Her letter to Madame Elisabeth demonstrated that she understood forgiveness and tried to practice it even toward those who had destroyed her family. Marie Antoinette remains one of the most recognizable figures from the French Revolution, perhaps even more famous in death than she ever was in life. Her story has been told and retold in books, plays, films, and operas. She has been the subject of serious historical study and popular fascination. The Palace of Versailles, where she lived, is now one of the most visited tourist sites in the world, and many visitors come specifically to see her private apartments at the Petit Trianon. The famous quote, "Let them eat cake," often attributed to Marie Antoinette, was almost certainly never said by her. The phrase appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's writings before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France, and historians generally agree it is apocryphal. But the fact that the quote is still associated with her name demonstrates how her reputation as an out-of-touch aristocrat has persisted through the centuries. Marie Antoinette lived during a period of dramatic historical change. She witnessed the end of the old regime and the birth of modern revolutionary politics. Her life spanned the height of absolute monarchy and its violent overthrow. She was born into the most powerful royal family in Europe and died as a convicted traitor, executed before a mob. Her story is both personally tragic and historically significant, representing the human cost of political upheaval and the dangers of a ruling class too distant from the people it governs. From the pampered archduchess playing in the gardens of Schönbrunn to the condemned prisoner climbing the steps of the guillotine, Marie Antoinette's life traced an arc that few could have predicted. She became a symbol of her era for better and worse. Her name remains synonymous with both the decadence of the old regime and the terrors of the revolution that destroyed it. She was, in the end, both a figure of history and a human being, a woman who experienced love, loss, fear and courage, and whose story continues to fascinate us more than 2 centuries after her death.